Story number 1.
It all started when I moved to the small town of Riverton, a sleepy, quiet place nestled on the outskirts of the mountains. It was the perfect escape after years of living in a city that never slept. The constant noise, the fast pace, the people, it was all too much for me. I wanted peace, and Riverton promised that. The house I rented was an old colonial-style building at the end of a quiet street, surrounded by thick trees and heavy foliage. The place was beautiful in a haunting, dilapidated way, but it was within my budget, and there was a certain charm about it that I couldn't resist. The house itself had been vacant for years, according to the landlord. It had once belonged to an elderly couple who had passed away, and after their death, the house sat empty, slowly falling into disrepair. I wasn't the first tenant, though. There had been a few others before me, but they all left after short stints. The landlord didn't mention that part to me, but after everything that happened, I understand why. The first night in the house was quiet. The wind rustled the leaves outside, and the creaky wooden floors seemed to groan with every step I took. I had just moved in, and I was feeling the usual excitement of a new place. It was my chance to start over. I unpacked some boxes, ordered a pizza, and settled in for a night of watching old movies. By midnight, I was exhausted, and I headed to bed. The silence in the house was heavy, but I thought nothing of it. It wasn't until I woke up at around 3 a.m. that things started to get strange. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, when I heard it. A faint scratching noise coming from somewhere below me. At first, I thought it was just a tree branch brushing against the window, but the sound grew louder and more insistent. It wasn't coming from outside, it was coming from within the walls. I lay perfectly still, listening, my heart beginning to race. The sound was rhythmic, like someone was moving around inside the walls, scratching and scraping. I tried to convince myself it was just rats, or maybe the house settling, but the noise continued until it felt like it was getting closer, right under my bed. I finally worked up the courage to check, throwing back the covers and standing up. I turned on the light and checked under the bed, but there was nothing there. The sound stopped as soon as I moved. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine as I got back into bed, trying to convince myself it was nothing. The next few days were uneventful. I went about my routine, worked during the day, quiet nights at home, getting used to the stillness of my new life. But every night, the noises came back. The scratching, the scurrying. Sometimes it would happen during the day as well, when I was alone in the house. I would hear something moving around upstairs, or the sound of footsteps from the hallway when no one was there. The logical part of me kept telling myself that it was just the house settling, but after a while, I couldn't ignore the growing sense of unease. I wasn't sure if it was my imagination running wild, or if the house really was haunted, but it felt like there was something or someone lurking in the shadows, watching me. It was a Thursday when I first saw it. I had gotten home from work late and was standing in the kitchen, fixing myself a late-night snack when I saw something strange in the reflection of the window. A figure, standing at the top of the stairs. I froze, my heart thudding in my chest. At first, I thought it was my reflection, but it wasn't. It was a shadowy figure, tall and thin, with no discernible features. It just stood there, staring at me. I quickly turned around, but there was no one there. The stairs were empty. My breath came in short, sharp gasps as I stood there, staring at the empty hallway. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, my skin prickling with cold. I didn't know what I had seen, but I knew one thing for sure. I was not alone in that house. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on the couch, wide awake, with the lights on, waiting for the next strange occurrence. And sure enough, it came. Around 2 a.m., I heard it again, the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from the hallway. But this time it wasn't just in the walls. This time it was on the floor, as if someone was walking right outside my door. I didn't dare open it. The following days were a blur of increasing anxiety. The figure appeared more frequently, always when I least expected it, always in the corner of my eye, never fully visible, but always watching. And the noises, they didn't stop. The scratching, the creaking, the footsteps. The house seemed to be alive, breathing, pulsing with an energy that made my skin crawl. I started leaving lights on throughout the house, hoping it would keep whatever was haunting me at bay. But it didn't help. The presence, whatever it was, grew stronger. I started hearing whispers too. Quiet, indistinguishable whispers that seemed to come from the walls themselves. They never said anything clear, but the tone was unmistakable. It was a warning. Leave. The word was repeated over and over again in a voice that was far too close to my ear, but I never saw anyone. The whispering always came from behind me, from somewhere just out of view. It was as if something or someone was following me around the house, getting closer with every passing day. That's when I decided to do some digging. I asked around town about the history of the house, but no one seemed to know much about it. The landlord wasn't much help either. He told me that the elderly couple who had lived there had passed away peacefully, and he didn't mention anything unusual about the place. But something didn't sit right with me. There was a darkness in the house, a weight that I couldn't shake. I had to know what I was dealing with. I went to the local library and started looking through Old Town records. It didn't take long for me to find something. The house had been built in the late 1800s, but it wasn't the age of the house that caught my attention. It was the previous owner. Her name was Clara Blackwell. The records were sparse, but one detail stood out. Clara had been obsessed with the house. She refused to leave it even when her health began to decline. In her final days, she reportedly spoke about a presence in the house, one that never let her rest. As I read on, I began to understand. Clara wasn't the first to leave the house. Several tenants had come and gone over the years, all with the same complaints: scratching noises, footsteps, and the feeling of being watched. Each one had left the house under strange circumstances, none of them staying long enough to figure out what was happening. I wasn't sure if I was ready to confront whatever was haunting the house, but I didn't feel like I had much choice. The whispers had become more frequent, and the figure seemed to be getting bolder. I could feel its presence even when it wasn't in my line of sight. It was watching me, waiting for me. That night, I decided to face it. I sat in the living room waiting for whatever would come next. The air was thick, the silence oppressive. I could feel the coldness creeping, the shadows growing longer, but I refused to look away. And then I saw it. It wasn't just a figure anymore. It was a man, tall, gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to pierce through me. He stood in the doorway, watching me with a gaze that made my stomach twist with fear. His face was pale, gaunt, and his clothes were old, from a time long past. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His presence was enough to make my blood run cold. I stood up slowly, backing away toward the door. The figure didn't move, just watched me. I could feel his cold, unyielding stare like a hand on my throat. "Leave," the whisper came again, louder now, clearer than before. The word echoed through my mind, reverberating off the walls, a command, not a request. I didn't need any more prompting. I grabbed my coat, my keys, and left the house that night, never looking back. I stayed with a friend for a few days, and when I returned to the house to gather my things, I found it had been rented out again. The new tenants would have to deal with whatever haunted that place now. I'd had enough. The last I heard, they left within a month. Story, the end. It was an unremarkable night in early autumn when Clara first started feeling that something was wrong. The wind had been blowing cold through the trees outside her apartment, rattling the windows and causing the faintest creak in the old building. At first, she attributed the unease to the usual weird noises of an aging structure, but something about that evening felt different. There was a presence in the air. Something or someone was watching. Clara lived alone in a small apartment on the second floor of a building on the outskirts of town. It wasn't the best neighborhood, but it wasn't the worst either. The building itself was a relic, its brick walls weathered by decades of neglect, and the staircase creaked with every step. She had moved in a year ago, hoping to escape from the noise and bustle of her old life, to find some peace and quiet. But peace and quiet, as it turned out, could often feel unsettling. She sat on the couch, scrolling through her phone. A quick glance at the clock revealed it was nearing midnight. Clara hadn't been able to shake the strange feeling all night, that sensation of being watched, like someone was lurking just beyond the edge of her vision. She had checked all the locks on the doors and windows, and though everything seemed secure, she couldn't shake the feeling of vulnerability. A soft knock echoed through the apartment, and Clara froze. She wasn't expecting anyone. The knock came again, more insistent this time, followed by a strange scraping sound, like fingernails running lightly over wood. Her heart raced in her chest, and her breath caught in her throat. There was no one there. She was alone. She hadn't heard anyone approach. Cautiously, she stood up and moved toward the door, feeling her heartbeat in her throat. She peered through the peephole. Nothing. The hallway outside was empty. She opened the door cautiously, stepping onto the dimly lit corridor. The building was quiet, the other apartments seemingly asleep. Still, she couldn't shake the nagging feeling that she wasn't alone. She quickly closed the door behind her and locked it again, trying to push away the dread that was building in her chest. What was happening? Was she just imagining things? The feeling of being watched didn't fade. In fact, it seemed to intensify, as though something or someone was closer now, just out of sight, hidden in the shadows. Clara began to check her apartment more thoroughly, making sure everything was in place. The front door was locked. The windows were secure. There was no sign of anyone having been there. But there was something else. On her desk, where she usually kept a pile of letters and bills, there was a piece of paper that she didn't remember seeing earlier. It was a small, crumpled note, and it sent an icy chill through her veins when she saw it. It read, "I'm watching you." Clara's hands trembled as she picked it up. There was no signature, no indication of who had left it, but it was unmistakably meant for her. She felt a cold shiver crawl up her spine as her mind raced. Who had been in her apartment? How did they get in? Panic gripped her. She grabbed her phone and dialed the number for the police, but the line clicked once and then fell silent. A low hum echoed in her ears, and the sensation of being watched grew stronger. Before she could react, there was a sudden thud at the window. Clara spun around, her heart pounding. She rushed to the window and threw open the curtains, but the only thing she saw was the empty street below. The wind had picked up again, and the branches of a nearby tree were swaying wildly, casting long shadows across the pavement. Still, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The next few days passed in a haze of tension and paranoia. Clara tried to convince herself that it was just her imagination, that she was overreacting, but the unease never left her. Each night, she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening for any sounds that might signal someone's presence. She found herself constantly checking the locks, peeking out the windows, convinced that someone was watching her from the street below. It wasn't long before the strange occurrences became more frequent. There were more notes, each one more chilling than the last. "I see you through the window. I'm getting closer." Each time, Clara would search the building and the surrounding area, but there was never anyone there. On the third night after the first note appeared, Clara woke to the sound of something scraping against the wall. It wasn't a noise that belonged in her apartment, at least not one she recognized. It sounded like nails dragging slowly, scraping against the drywall. She lay still in bed, terrified to move, as the sound grew louder, closer. The noise seemed to be coming from the walls themselves. Clara tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just the house settling, the building creaking under the weight of its age. But the sound was too deliberate, too methodical. Unable to stay still any longer, Clara jumped out of bed and grabbed the nearest object she could find, a lamp, and crept toward the wall where the noise seemed to be coming from. As she reached the corner, the scraping stopped. The silence was suffocating. But Clara wasn't about to back down now. She slammed the lamp against the wall in frustration, the crash echoing in the stillness of the apartment. And then, from the other side of the wall, she heard a voice. "Why are you so scared?" it whispered, low and cold, as if it had been waiting for her to ask. Clara's blood ran cold. She turned and fled from the room, her mind racing with disbelief. Was she losing her mind? Was someone really in the walls? She bolted down the stairs and out into the street, desperate for a moment of clarity. But as she stood there in the dim streetlight, she saw something that made her freeze. A figure, standing at the far end of the alley, staring at her. Its features were indistinct, lost in the darkness, but Clara felt its gaze on her like a physical weight. She couldn't move, couldn't look away. The figure didn't approach, it didn't move at all. It just stood there, waiting. Clara was paralyzed with fear. Her heart pounded in her chest as she struggled to find the strength to look away, and then just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure vanished into the night. For a moment, Clara stood still, trying to process what she had just seen. But before she could make sense of it, the scraping noise came again, closer this time. It was coming from the apartment, from the walls, from the ceiling. It was as though whatever was stalking her had moved inside her own home. Clara didn't know what to do. She couldn't stay in the apartment any longer, but she couldn't escape the feeling that something was hunting her, following her, no matter where she went. She grabbed her things and fled into the night, not knowing where to turn. As she walked through the darkened streets, a cold wind brushing against her skin, Clara realized with growing horror that the feeling of being watched had never truly left her. She had been followed. She had always been followed. And now it seemed the one who was stalking her was getting closer, closing in. There would be no escape. Story the end.
Story number 3.
It was late fall when I moved into the old house on Elm Street. It wasn't my first choice, but at the time I was desperate for a place to live. I had just broken up with my girlfriend and was looking for somewhere cheap to stay. The house was large, over 100 years old, and was being rented out for a fraction of what other properties in the area were going for. The landlord, Mrs. Gibbons, was an elderly woman with a thin smile that never quite reached her eyes. She told me the house had been in her family for generations, but that she was now the last living relative. She was polite enough, but I noticed she seemed uncomfortable when I asked about the house's history. She wouldn't answer directly, saying only that it was a quiet place. Despite her odd behavior, I was happy to sign the lease and move in. It was a large, beautiful Victorian-style house with high ceilings, dark wooden floors, and large windows that let in the autumn sunlight. But even as I unloaded boxes into the house, something felt off. The air was thick, and the silence that blanketed the house was unnerving. For the first few days, I chalked it up to being in an unfamiliar place. It wasn't unusual for an old house to have creaks and groans, and I was simply adjusting. But soon enough, I started hearing things at night, strange noises that I couldn't explain. At first, I thought it was the wind, but then the sounds became more distinct. There was the soft shuffle of footsteps in the hallway outside my room, a light tapping on the walls, and sometimes, in the dead of night, I would hear a soft, mournful sigh. One night, while I was sitting in the living room reading, I heard the tapping again. I tried to ignore it, but it was persistent. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from the wall just next to the fireplace. I stood up and walked over, thinking it might just be a rodent in the walls, but when I pressed my ear against the surface, the tapping stopped. I moved away, confused, but as soon as I sat back down, it started again. This time, it sounded closer. I stood up, heart pounding, and made my way through the house, following the sound. The footsteps I had been hearing at night also seemed to be getting louder, as if someone was walking around the house. I checked every room. The upstairs hallway was dark, and when I passed by the mirror at the end of the corridor, I thought I saw something move behind me. I spun around, but nothing was there. Just my reflection staring back at me. I decided to head back to the living room, but when I passed the door to the attic, I stopped. The door was slightly ajar. I had never opened it. In fact, Mrs. Gibbons had told me the attic was off limits, but something about the way the door was cracked open made me uneasy. I knew I should leave it alone, but curiosity got the better of me. As I opened the door, a cold gust of air hit my face, sending a shiver down my spine. I stepped inside the attic, which smelled of dust and mildew. The room was filled with old furniture covered in white sheets, boxes, and forgotten trinkets. There was a strange stillness to the room, an oppressive weight in the air that made it hard to breathe. I was about to turn back when I noticed something strange in the corner of the room. There was a large, ornate mirror. The frame was old, twisted with intricate designs, but the glass was clear, almost too clear. As I approached, I felt my heart race. I could swear I saw something moving behind the reflection, like a figure standing just out of sight. I reached out and touched the cold surface of the mirror. Suddenly, a cold hand gripped my shoulder from behind, making me spin around in a panic. But there was nothing there. My breath quickened, and I could feel the panic rising in my chest. The room felt smaller, like the walls were closing in on me. I turned back to the mirror and saw something I hadn't noticed before. A small, faint smudge at the bottom corner of the glass. It was too far down to be a reflection of anything in the room, but when I leaned in closer, I could make out a word. It was just one word, written in what looked like smeared ink or blood. Leave. My heart skipped a beat. I stumbled back, my mind racing. I had to get out of there. As I turned to leave, I heard the sound of footsteps again. This time they were coming from above me, from the floor of the attic itself. I froze in place, unable to move. The footsteps grew louder, closer. I had to get out. I turned and ran, my legs nearly giving out beneath me as I bolted for the door. When I reached the hallway, I slammed the door behind me and locked it, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't look back. For the next few days, I tried to convince myself it was nothing. It was just my imagination, I told myself. The house was old, and old houses made strange noises, but the sounds didn't stop. The footsteps continued, always just out of sight, always in the corners of the house, in the walls, in the ceilings. And then the dreams started. At first, they were just fleeting images, a shadowy figure standing in the hallway, a figure moving just out of the corner of my eye. But they soon grew more vivid. I would dream of the attic, of the mirror, of a dark, empty space stretching out before me, and in the distance, I could hear the soft whisper of a voice calling my name. In one dream, I saw a woman standing in front of the mirror, her face twisted in anguish. She reached out, her hand pressing against the glass as if trying to escape. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. I could feel the weight of her despair, the suffocating loneliness that filled the air around her. Then one night, the dreams became something else. I woke up in a cold sweat, my heart racing. I could have sworn I had heard something moving in the room with me. The darkness was thick, oppressive, and as I sat up, I saw a figure standing at the foot of my bed. It was a woman, her face obscured by shadows, but I could see her hands reaching toward me. I froze, unable to scream. My body was paralyzed with fear, and all I could do was stare at her as she moved closer, until her breath was cold against my skin. The figure reached out, brushing my cheek, and I could hear her whisper, "You shouldn't have come here." I woke up with a start, gasping for air. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it might burst from my chest. I looked around, but the room was empty. The house was silent, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was there, watching me. The next morning, I tried to leave. I packed up my things, called Mrs. Gibbons, and told her I couldn't stay any longer. She didn't argue, but when I went to hand over the keys, she looked at me with that same thin, unsettling smile. "Some people never leave," she said, her voice low and filled with an unspoken warning. I left without saying another word, but as I drove away from the house, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me. Every turn, every mile I drove, the weight on my chest only grew heavier until it felt like I was being suffocated by the memories of that place. And now, months later, I still hear the footsteps. Late at night, I'll hear them in the walls of my apartment, moving just beyond my reach. I can't shake the feeling that something is always with me, always watching me from the shadows. No matter where I go, it follows me. And sometimes in the dead of night, I hear a whisper in the dark, "You shouldn't have left." Story the end.
Story number 4.
It had been a quiet few months in Amanda's life after moving to the old Victorian house on Oakwood Drive. The house, a looming structure with dark ivy crawling up the brick walls, was everything she'd dreamed of, a little weathered, but full of charm. She had moved from a cramped apartment in the city to escape the noise, to find peace in the countryside. The realtor assured her the house had a character, just the kind she was looking for. The first few days were idyllic. She spent her time unpacking and getting to know the house, the creaking floorboards, the faint smell of old wood, and the drafts through the windows all felt like the charming details of a home with history. There was something comforting about the solitude, and she was happy to be far away from her previous chaotic life. But it wasn't long before Amanda started noticing things that didn't make sense. It started with a feeling of being watched. The kind of sensation that crawls under your skin, making you glance over your shoulder even though you know there's nothing there. At first, Amanda chalked it up to being in a new place. Maybe it was just the old house settling. But it didn't stop. One evening, as she sat reading on the couch, she heard a soft thud coming from upstairs. She froze, the book in her hands forgotten as her heart raced. The sound was too deliberate to be the house shifting. It was something or someone moving. Slowly, she stood up, cautiously stepping toward the staircase that led to the second floor. She didn't want to go upstairs, but the noise was nagging at her. The second she reached the bottom of the stairs, the noise stopped. Amanda held her breath, straining to hear any more movement. Nothing. The house was silent again. She slowly ascended the stairs, looking around each corner before taking another step. There was no one there. Nothing. She shook her head, telling herself it was just the house. But the feeling of being watched persisted. That night, Amanda locked all the doors and windows before settling into bed. But sleep didn't come easy. The silence of the house felt too thick, like it was pressing against her. She lay still, trying to convince herself that everything was fine, that she was just being paranoid. But then around 2 a.m., she heard something faint. A whisper, almost imperceptible. "Get out." Her heart stopped. The voice wasn't hers, and it wasn't anyone she knew. It was a rasping, breathy whisper, like it was coming from the walls themselves. Amanda's throat went dry, and she sat up in bed, straining to hear if it would come again. Nothing. Was it a dream? A figment of her imagination? She didn't know, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The next few days were filled with little oddities. Things out of place, noises when there should have been silence, the feeling of eyes on her when she walked into certain rooms. But one evening, everything changed. Amanda had been spending the night in the living room, doing some work on her laptop. She'd heard a faint tapping noise coming from the hallway outside the room earlier, but had dismissed it as the wind or perhaps the house settling. But now, it was louder, persistent, and it was coming from the door. She stood up, her laptop screen still glowing in the dim room, and approached the door cautiously. Her hand hesitated on the knob, a sudden chill crawling up her spine. She slowly turned the handle, and the door creaked open to reveal the hallway bathed in the soft glow of moonlight coming from a small window. The hallway was empty, but then Amanda saw it. At the far end of the hall, a shadow moved. At first, she thought it was just the house's creaks playing tricks on her eyes, but the shadow didn't dissipate. It moved again, almost as if it were pacing back and forth. Frozen in place, Amanda's breath hitched in her throat. "Hello," she called out, her voice trembling. No answer. The shadow continued its erratic motion, now moving closer to her. Her instincts screamed at her to run, but she was paralyzed. Something inside her told her to stay, to watch, to understand what was happening. As the shadow neared, it became clearer. Faint, dark, and human-like, though not quite fully formed. It was as if it existed in pieces, its edges blurry, like a distorted figure shifting between the walls and the air. Amanda's heart hammered in her chest. She could barely breathe, but somehow she stepped forward. She crossed the threshold into the hallway, the shadow coming closer with each step. When she was just a few feet away, the figure suddenly stopped, its form solidifying for a brief moment. It was a man, or something that looked like a man, standing still as if he were waiting for her. His face was dark, obscured by shadows, but there was something about his presence that made her blood run cold. He didn't speak. He didn't move. He simply stood there, staring at her. Then, with a sudden, sharp movement, he disappeared into the walls, leaving Amanda in the hallway, completely alone. She bolted back into the living room, locking the door behind her. But no matter how hard she tried to convince herself that she had imagined it, the feeling lingered. The presence in the house was real. Someone was watching her. That night, Amanda couldn't sleep. She kept hearing sounds, scratching noises from the walls, soft thumps from upstairs. She was sure she wasn't alone in the house. And then around 4 a.m., she heard a tap at her window. Her heart stopped. The window was on the second floor where no one could easily reach, but the tapping came again. Slow, rhythmic, deliberate. Terrified, Amanda grabbed her phone and dialed the number of her friend, Erin. The phone rang and rang, but Erin didn't pick up. Panicked, Amanda sent her a text, begging her to come over, but there was no response. She felt trapped, helpless in the house that was no longer hers. The tapping grew louder, closer. Amanda stood frozen, clutching her phone, waiting for the next sound, the next movement. Finally, the tapping stopped, But then a whisper, soft and chilling, filled the room. "Let me in." Amanda's blood ran cold. The voice was back. But this time it wasn't coming from the walls. It was coming from the window, from the very spot where the tapping had started. Her mind raced. She didn't know what to do. Who was it? What did it want? She glanced over at the window, her eyes locked on the dark shape beyond the glass. The shadow stood there, still and unmoving, like it was waiting. The wind outside picked up, and the trees outside shook in the gusts. In a burst of terror, Amanda grabbed the nearest object, a lamp, and hurled it at the window. The glass shattered on impact, and for a brief moment she thought she saw the figure move. But then, it was gone. Amanda ran out of the house in a frenzy, not stopping until she reached the end of the driveway. She didn't look back. She didn't want to know what might be waiting for her inside. All she knew was that she couldn't stay another moment in that house. As she called Aaron to ask for help, she glanced back toward the house. The light in the attic window flickered briefly, and for just a split second, Amanda thought she saw a figure standing behind the glass, staring down at her. She couldn't stay there. Whatever was haunting that house had been waiting for her, watching her, following her every move. And it wasn't done yet. Story, the end.
Story number 5.
I can begin crafting the story for you, but as the response length is limited, I will send it in parts. Let's start with the first part. When I moved into the small house on Chestnut Street, I didn't expect anything unusual to happen. It was a quaint little cottage-style home, tucked away at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac. It was a fresh start for me. New city, new job, new everything. I had just gotten out of a difficult relationship, and I needed a place where I could reset and rebuild. The house was cheap for the area, though it was clear it had been unoccupied for some time. The landlord, Mr. Kramer, seemed eager to get rid of it. He was an older man, quiet and gruff, but he seemed like he wanted to be rid of the house more than anything. I didn't ask too many questions, too much of a hassle, and he didn't offer any information beyond the basic details about the lease. At first, everything seemed fine. The house was small but cozy, with a living room, a kitchen, 2 bedrooms, and a small bathroom. The floors were a bit creaky, and the walls were thin, but nothing too alarming. The backyard was overgrown, but the space was inviting, and the neighborhood felt peaceful enough. Still, something about the place felt off. I couldn't explain it. It was as if I had stepped into a place that wasn't meant for me, as if the house had a history of its own, one that I wasn't a part of. I tried to ignore it, telling myself I was just being paranoid. It was probably just the stress of my breakup that was still hanging over me. But things began to happen almost immediately. The first night I stayed there, I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of someone, moving around in the kitchen. I lay still in my bed, staring into the darkness, listening to the faint creak of floorboards. My heart pounded in my chest. I assumed it was a mouse or perhaps a cat, but as I lay there listening, the sound grew clearer, more deliberate, and human. I was frozen, staring at the door to the hallway, knowing I should get up and check, but not wanting to. I was alone in the house. There was no one else there. Slowly, I worked up the courage to pull back the covers and slip out of bed. I tiptoed to the door, my breath shallow in my chest. As I cracked it open, the sound stopped. Absolute silence. I stepped into the hallway, heart thudding in my chest, and crept toward the kitchen. The lights were off, and there was nothing out of place, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. I checked the cabinets, the drawers, and the counters. Nothing. The house was still. It had been nothing but the wind or my overactive imagination, I thought. The next night, the sounds returned. This time I wasn't as scared. I had already convinced myself that it was the house settling, that it was nothing. But when I went into the kitchen, the sound wasn't just creaks. It was as if something was moving, something scraping against the floor. I grabbed a flashlight, my pulse quickening. I turned it on and scanned the kitchen, the beam bouncing from one corner to the next, and then I saw it. On the floor, just beside the fridge, was a trail of dust. But it wasn't just dust. It was footprints, thin, clear imprints on the floor, as if someone had walked through and left a mark on the dust. My breath caught in my throat. I blinked, staring down at the marks, trying to make sense of them. They didn't look like any kind of animal tracks, and they certainly weren't mine. I backed away from the kitchen slowly, my mind racing. It had to be some kind of prank. Maybe it was someone else, someone with a key to the house, sneaking in at night. But the landlord had assured me that no one else had access, and there was no sign of a break-in. The nights after that were uneventful, but I could feel the house change. It wasn't just the sounds or the eerie feeling. It was like there was a presence there, something lingering just at the edge of my awareness. I could never quite shake the feeling that I was being watched, that there was something in the shadows lurking just out of sight. And then came the dreams. They started a week after I first moved in. At first, they were vague, blurry, fleeting images, nothing too disturbing. But as the nights passed, they grew darker. I dreamt of the house, of walking through its halls, but the air was thick, oppressive, and the walls were covered in shadow. I would walk through rooms that weren't there during the day, rooms that seemed to stretch on forever, and in those rooms I would see figures. Silent figures that stood in the corners, just watching me. There were no faces, just shapes, indistinct and hazy. But the worst part of these dreams wasn't the figures. It was the feeling of being drawn into them, of being pulled towards something I didn't want to understand. One night, I woke up gasping for air. My sheets were tangled around me and I was drenched in sweat. I sat up in bed, my heart hammering in my chest. I looked around the room, but there was nothing. The air was still, too still, and I could hear the faintest rustle, like fabric brushing against itself. The sound was coming from the hallway, soft but unmistakable. I didn't want to look, didn't want to acknowledge it, but my legs moved on their own. I slid out of bed, moving slowly toward the door, my breathing shallow. The light from the hallway was faint, but enough to see that the door to the bathroom was open. Just a crack. It hadn't been open when I went to bed. I felt a chill crawl up my spine as I stared at the gap in the door, but my legs were rooted to the floor. Then the rustling stopped. I don't know why, but I pushed the door open. The bathroom was empty, but it was the mirror that caught my attention. It was old, antique in fact, and covered in steam. I wasn't sure if I had left the shower on when I had gone to bed, but the mirror was fogged up, the misty surface reflecting the room behind me. That's when I saw it. Written in the condensation on the glass, clear as day, was the word, leave. I blinked, feeling my stomach drop. The word was smeared across the mirror, as if someone had used their finger to write it. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. My body screamed at me to run, to get out, but I couldn't move. I was rooted in place, staring at that word like it was a message meant for me, something I couldn't ignore. The next morning, I packed up and left the house, determined to never return. The landlord had been kind enough to let me out of the lease early, though I'm sure he was relieved to see me go. I never spoke to him about the strange things I had experienced. I had no answers, and frankly, I didn't want any. I just wanted to forget about the house, the cold feeling that had followed me there, the strange figure in the dark. But the feeling didn't go away. Even after I moved out, I started noticing strange things. Late at night, I would hear footsteps. At first, I thought I was just hearing things, but then it happened again and again. The sound would echo in my apartment, like someone was pacing outside my door. When I opened it, there would be no one there. My neighbors never mentioned anything, and the apartment building itself was quiet. The dreams didn't stop either. They continued, and the figures in the shadows only grew more distinct, more menacing. I couldn't shake the feeling that the house on Chestnut Street had followed me, that whatever had been there, whatever I had disturbed, was still with me. I don't know how much longer I can take it. I don't know if I'll ever escape whatever is following me. But I can tell you one thing, it won't leave. Story the end.
Story number 6.
There's a small, quiet town just outside of Asheville, North Carolina, where I used to live. The kind of place where everyone knows everyone, and there's a sense of peace you can't quite find in the city. It was my sanctuary after a rough patch in my life. I had just gone through a messy breakup, and I thought I'd found a fresh start when I moved to this town and rented a house on the edge of the woods. The house was old, built in the 1920s, but charming in a way that made me feel comfortable. The windows were tall, the floors creaked with age, and the garden out front was overgrown with ivy and wildflowers. The house had character, but it was also a bit rundown. just the way I liked it. It felt like a place where I could hide away from the world, and that's exactly what I needed. The first few days were peaceful. I spent time cleaning, organizing, and getting settled. But by the end of the week, strange things started happening. Little things at first, doors left slightly ajar when I was sure I'd closed them, strange drafts where there shouldn't have been any, lights flickering at odd hours. At first, I brushed it off as the house being old, settling noises and old wiring. But then it escalated. I had just finished dinner one evening when I heard footsteps upstairs. I froze. The house was completely empty. I was alone. It wasn't the house settling. It was distinct, deliberate steps. At first, I thought I was just hearing things. But then it happened again, closer this time, like someone walking down the hallway upstairs. I hesitated, heart pounding, before grabbing my phone and dialing my friend Anna. "Hey," I said, trying to sound casual but feeling a lump in my throat. "I'm hearing some weird noises here. It sounds like someone's walking upstairs." Anna laughed. "You're probably just hearing things. It's an old house, right?" "I guess," I replied, but the hairs on the back of my neck were standing on end. I didn't go upstairs that night. I stayed on the couch, watching TV, trying to convince myself it was nothing. But when I finally went to bed around midnight, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It was that unnerving sensation you get when you know someone is in the room with you, even though you can't see them. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But it felt so real, like someone was standing at the foot of my bed. That night, I didn't sleep much. I woke up at every creak of the house, every flicker of light, but it wasn't until the next day that I realized something wasn't right. I was sitting at my kitchen table having breakfast when I noticed something odd. On the counter, just a few feet away from me, was a small, delicate silver locket. I was certain it hadn't been there when I went to bed the night before. I had checked the counter before going to sleep, and there had been nothing there. The locket looked antique, but it wasn't mine. I didn't recognize it. I picked it up, turning it over in my hands, trying to make sense of it. But there was nothing to explain its presence. I set it back down and tried to forget about it. Maybe it was just a mistake, a random item left behind by the previous tenants, though I couldn't figure out how they could have left it without me noticing. Over the next few days, the noises grew louder. The footsteps upstairs were constant, like someone pacing back and forth. But the strangest part was when I would wake up in the middle of the night and find my bathroom light on. I knew I had turned it off before bed, but it was always on when I walked into the hallway. This happened every night. At first, I thought I was forgetting to turn it off, but the more it happened, the more I became convinced something else was at play. Then came the whispering. One evening, I was sitting in the living room, reading, when I heard a soft, unintelligible whisper from behind me. It was so faint, I wasn't sure if I had actually heard it or if it was just my imagination. But as the minutes ticked by, I began to hear it again. A faint, rasping voice saying words I couldn't make out. I stood up, heart racing, and turned around to find nothing. No one was there. The whispers didn't stop. They were low, almost imperceptible, but they were there, coming from the dark corners of the room, from behind closed doors. It was as if something was trying to communicate, but I couldn't understand it. I started to become paranoid. I checked every door and window to make sure they were locked. I kept the lights on at night. I even started sleeping with a baseball bat by my bed, just in case. But the feeling of being watched only grew stronger. I couldn't escape it. And then, one night, I heard the whispering again. But this time, it was clear. "Get out!" The words were unmistakable. I shot out of bed, my heart in my throat, and stood frozen for a few moments in the darkness. The voice had come from right behind me, from the corner of the room. It was a deep, gravelly voice, cold and unsettling. I could feel my blood run cold. The air felt thick, oppressive. I turned on the lights, scanning the room, but there was no one there. I checked the doors. Locked. I checked the windows. Closed. There was no explanation. My mind raced, trying to rationalize what was happening. Could I have imagined it? Could it have been the house settling? But this felt different. The voice was too clear, too real. That was the turning point. The next day, I called Anna. She agreed to come over that evening, though she didn't believe me. She thought I was just being paranoid. When Anna arrived, I showed her the locket, which I'd found on the counter again. She examined it closely and then laughed. "It's a vintage piece," she said, "but it's definitely not something you'd find lying around here." "I didn't leave it there," I said, my voice trembling. "I don't know how it got there." We decided to explore the house together. Anna was skeptical but humored me. We started in the attic. The door to it had always been locked, and when I tried to open it earlier, I couldn't. But now, with Anna there, I felt a strange compulsion to unlock it. I managed to find the old key and unlocked the door. The attic was dimly lit, the air thick with dust. As we stepped inside, the temperature dropped. The room felt cold, colder than the rest of the house, and the floorboards creaked beneath our feet. We explored the space, but all we found were old boxes and forgotten furniture. There were no clues, no signs that anything unusual had ever happened there. That is, until Anna pulled something from a box in the corner. It was a journal, its cover weathered and old. She handed it to me, and as I flipped through the pages, I felt a chill creep up my spine. The handwriting inside was erratic, scribbled hastily across the pages. It told the story of a woman who had lived in the house years ago. She spoke of being stalked, watched by a presence that she couldn't see. She described hearing footsteps when no one was there, feeling an oppressive presence in the house, and hearing whispering voices telling her to leave. As I read the journal, the whispers began again, growing louder, more urgent. The voice seemed to be coming from the pages themselves, as if the words were speaking to me. I could feel it pressing in on me, suffocating me. The whispers became clearer, repeating the same phrase over and over again. "Get out!" I slammed the journal shut, my hands shaking. Anna grabbed my arm, her face pale. "We need to leave. Now." We didn't waste any time. We ran down the stairs, out of the house, and into the car. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. For a split second, I thought I saw someone standing in the window, watching us drive away. I never went back to that house. I left it behind, sold it as quickly as I could. The last time I passed by it, it looked just as it had when I first moved in. Silent, abandoned. But I knew that something was still there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the next person to come along. And deep down, I knew that whatever it wasn't done with me. Story the end.
Story number 7.
I moved into the house on Maple Street in the fall of 2016, looking for a fresh start after the chaos of the past few years. A new job, a new town, and a change of pace seemed like just what I needed to reset my life. The house was an old 2-story Victorian that had been on the market for quite a while. It was affordable and had plenty of character, albeit a little rundown. The real estate agent assured me it was a great deal, and I, in my excitement, overlooked some of the peculiarities. The house had a large, overgrown front yard, with an iron gate that squeaked when opened. The porch had the sort of charm that seemed to invite you in, but the wooden steps were weathered and unstable, threatening to collapse with every step. Despite its age, I felt a strange pull to the house, like it was meant to be mine. It felt like the kind of place where people would hear the stories of a family history that had been left behind. And I was ready to make new memories, no matter what ghosts the house might have been hiding. The first few weeks passed without much incident. I spent my evenings unpacking boxes, rearranging furniture, and getting to know the town. The neighbors were friendly, if a little distant, but everyone seemed to go about their business, never making much of an effort to engage. The house itself was peaceful, at least on the surface. But that first night I slept there, things started to feel wrong. It was late, and I had just finished reading in bed when I heard it. A soft thud from downstairs, as if something had fallen. I figured it was just the house settling. Houses do that. But when I tried to go back to sleep, I heard it again, a loud creak followed by another thud. This time I sat up in bed, straining my ears. I had no idea what could be making the noise. There was nothing downstairs that could fall, and the house had been empty for months before I moved in. I got up cautiously, grabbing my phone as a flashlight, and went downstairs to check. The living room was empty, the furniture undisturbed. But as I turned to head back toward the kitchen, I noticed something strange. A small leather-bound book on the floor near the fireplace. It wasn't mine. I didn't even recognize it. My heart skipped a beat. I had checked the living room earlier, and that book had not been there. I picked it up, feeling a strange sense of unease creep over me. The pages of the book were yellowed, the edges frayed. I opened it slowly, careful not to tear any of the delicate pages. The writing inside was in a hurried scrawl, and it was dated 1957. The entries spoke of strange happenings, of hearing footsteps in the house when no one was there, of whispers in the dark, of cold spots in rooms where no draft should have been. But one entry stood out among the rest, written in a shaking hand. I am being watched. I closed the book quickly, feeling a chill spread across my skin. I didn't know who had left it or why, but I knew I didn't want to be the one to find out. I tucked it back into the corner by the fireplace and made my way back upstairs. The feeling that I wasn't alone lingered, but I tried to push it away, thinking I was just being paranoid. Over the next few days, I started noticing more and more strange things. Lights flickering in rooms I hadn't been in, shadows moving in the corner of my eye, the constant feeling that someone was just behind me. It didn't help that the house was old. There were creaks, groans, and bangs that seemed to come from nowhere. But no matter how hard I tried to convince myself it was all just part of the house settling, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The worst part was the footsteps. They started in the hallway, a slow, deliberate step, as though someone was pacing just outside my bedroom door. But when I'd open the door, no one would be there. I thought it could be my imagination playing tricks on me, but after a few nights of hearing them, I was convinced someone was in the house with me. I started locking the doors before bed, checking windows and bolting them shut. But every night, the footsteps would return. One evening, I decided to go down to the basement to see if I could find any clues as to what was causing the noises. The basement door had always been a little hard to open, but that night it felt especially heavy. The moment I stepped inside, I felt an overwhelming sense of coldness, as though the temperature had dropped by several degrees. I turned on the light, and the bulb flickered before illuminating the space. It was a small, cluttered basement filled with old furniture, boxes, and a few forgotten tools. There was nothing particularly unusual about it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched again. I moved past the piles of old junk, trying to push the creeping sensation aside, and that's when I noticed it. Something out of place among the clutter. A small wooden box tucked away behind an old trunk. The box was ornate with strange symbols carved into its surface. I reached out and touched it, feeling an odd warmth in my fingertips. As I opened the box, I was struck by what I saw. An old photograph, torn and faded with age, of a young woman. She was standing in front of the house, smiling faintly, but there was something unsettling about her eyes, something hollow, as though she wasn't really looking at the camera. There was a name written on the back, Evelyn. I turned the photo over, my heart racing, but that's when I heard it again. The unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoing from the stairs behind me. My head snapped around, but there was no one there. My pulse quickened. I turned off the basement light, slammed the box shut, and bolted up the stairs. That night, I locked every door in the house and went to bed, praying the footsteps would stop. But they didn't. The pacing continued. I didn't know what to do. I thought about calling someone, maybe a friend or a professional. But part of me was too afraid to admit just how terrified I had become. I began to spend my nights driving around the town, trying to escape the oppressive weight of the house. But eventually, I had to face it. I couldn't keep running. A week later, I decided to take another look at the journal I had found earlier. The more I read, the more I felt connected to it, as though the words were meant for me. The entry that had caught my attention, the one that said, "I am being watched," seemed almost prophetic. It felt as if the person who had written those words had somehow known what was coming. I looked at the photo of Evelyn again, and a strange thought crossed my mind. Was this woman connected to the house somehow? That night, I decided to go to the local library and do some research on the house's history. I found a small section of Old Town records tucked away in a dusty corner. The librarian was kind enough to help me dig through them. We found something. The house had been built by a man named Charles Hendricks, a wealthy businessman who had lived in the area in the late 1800s. There were rumors about strange events surrounding the house during his time there: disappearances, people hearing voices, and unexplained happenings. But there was one name that kept coming up in the records: Evelyn. Evelyn had been Charles's wife. She had died under mysterious circumstances, and her death had been ruled a suicide, though no one ever believed it. There were whispers that she had been haunted by something in the house that drove her to despair. I stared at the records, feeling the pieces of the puzzle click into place. The next few days were unbearable. The footsteps grew louder, and the whispers more distinct. They no longer just filled the air, they filled my mind. The feeling of being watched, of someone standing just behind me, became so intense that I could hardly stand it. One night while I was sitting on the couch trying to ignore the sensation, I looked up and saw her. At first it was just a shadow, a figure standing in the hallway, watching me. But when I blinked, she was clearer. Evelyn. The same woman from the photo, dressed in an old-fashioned gown, her face pale, her eyes dark and hollow. She didn't speak. She just stood there, staring at me. My blood ran cold. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't move. The apparition slowly began to walk toward me, her footsteps soft, deliberate, but without sound. I tried to stand to get away, but my body refused to obey. She stopped just in front of me and finally spoke, her voice hollow, echoing in the space around us. Leave. It was a command, not a plea. She repeated it once more, and this time, the power behind her voice was enough to shatter whatever composure I had left. I ran from the house that night and never looked back. The next morning, I put the house up for sale. It sold quickly, though I never spoke to the new owners. The house on Maple Street still stands, and every time I drive by, I can't help but glance at the windows, wondering if Evelyn still watches from the other side, waiting for the next person to fall into her trap. Story the end.